The Zirak believed themselves to be the toughest species in the galaxy. Not the strongest. Plenty of brutes out there could crush a Zirak skull with enough effort. Not the smartest, though they certainly wouldn't admit that out loud. No, what truly set them apart was their legendary pain tolerance. It was more than just a biological advantage. Pain, to them, was a rite of passage. A warrior's worth was measured not by how many enemies they felled, but by how much suffering they could endure without breaking. Younglings barely out of their shells were expected to withstand ceremonial burns. Soldiers in training stood unmoving as their instructors drove serrated knives through their palms. Their most celebrated war heroes were the ones who had survived the most horrific injuries and had the scars to prove it. So when they captured a human soldier, a species they had been told was weak, soft, and hopelessly fragile, the Zirak were not just uninterested in his military value. They were actively amused. General Vorin Kazera observed the prisoner through the reinforced observation glass of the holding chamber. The human sat slumped against the cold metal wall, his hands bound behind his back, a gash on his forehead still sluggishly leaking blood. His uniform was torn, his face was battered, but there was something about his posture that irked Vorin. He wasn't begging. He wasn't even glaring in defiance. He looked bored. Vorin's mandibles clicked together in irritation. He should be afraid. Commander Zak, his second in command, tilted his head. Maybe he doesn't know what's coming. Vorin grunted. Then we should educate him. He turned to the nearest guard. Bring in the induction rods. Let's start with a baseline test. The human barely reacted when they dragged him to the center of the chamber and restrained him upright. His hazel eyes flicked between them with detached curiosity, like a man watching a particularly dull documentary. Vorin stepped forward, placing a clawed hand on the human's shoulder, his grip tightening just enough to hint at the pain to come. Human, he rumbled, you're going to tell us everything we wish to know. Cooperation will lessen your suffering. The human blinked at him. Wow, you actually said that with a straight face. Vorin's mandibles twitched. What? I mean, come on. You sound like a cartoon villain. The human grinned despite his bruises. You gonna twirl a mustache next? Zak stiffened. What is a mustache? Vorin ignored him, narrowing his yellow eyes. You joke now. You will not be laughing soon. He nodded to the technician, who activated the induction rods. Electricity arced between the metal prongs before they pressed against the human's exposed side. A high-frequency pulse shot through his nervous system, designed to overload pain receptors in a way even the strongest Zirak warriors struggled against. The human tensed. His muscles seized. His breath hitched. Then, he let out a strangled noise that made every Zirak in the room lean forward in anticipation. He was laughing? Vorin's mandibles clicked in disbelief. What? Oh man, the human wheezed, still chuckling between ragged breaths. That it felt just like he gasped, shaking his head. You ever touch an old Earth battery with your tongue? That's exactly what that felt like. Zak turned to Vorin. Is that an insult? Vorin's tail lashed once in irritation. Increase the intensity. The technician hesitated. Sir, if we go beyond this setting. Do it. A higher voltage coursed through the rods. The human clenched his jaw, his body jerking involuntarily, but when the electricity cut off, he exhaled sharply and muttered, Jesus. That's like licking a car battery. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but still. Vorin's eyes narrowed. I do not know what a car battery is, but I suspect you are mocking me. Wow, you catch on quick? Zak took a step closer. This does not make sense. Humans are supposed to have poor pain resistance. Oh, we do. The human agreed easily. I screamed like a baby last week when I stubbed my toe. Vorin hissed. Then why are you not screaming now? The human lifted his chin slightly, his lopsided grin revealing a bloodied tooth. Maybe your pain tolerance test just sucks. Zak let out a guttural snarl. We have warriors who survived impalement through multiple organs without making a sound. Cool. I had my appendix removed and was eating ice cream the next day. The room fell silent. Vorin turned to the technician. What is an appendix? The technician hesitated, pulling up a holographic screen and quickly scanning through human anatomy files. It appears to be a completely useless organ that occasionally inflames and must be surgically removed. Voron's gaze snapped back to the human. You were cut open and did not even care? The human shrugged. Oh, I cared. I was just also really excited about the ice cream. Zack took a slow step back. This is unnatural. No, this is just human biology, the prisoner said cheerfully. Ever heard of adrenaline? Endorphins? The placebo effect? Pain is mostly in your head. He nodded toward the technician. You got any more of those shock sticks? They're kind of ticklish. Voron's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just defiance. This was something else entirely. He could see it now in the human's posture. Not arrogance, not bravado, but genuine amusement. For the first time, Voron felt something he had never encountered in an interrogation chamber before. Doubt. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if, perhaps, the Zirac had made a terrible mistake. Sergeant Daniel Carter had been in some bad situations before. There was the time his drop pod malfunctioned mid-descent, turning a routine orbital insertion into a barely controlled nosedive that left him buried up to his ribs in alien shrubbery. There was the time he got lost behind enemy lines and had to survive for 3 days on something that, in hindsight, was definitely venomous. And of course, there was the time he tried to eat an entire ghost pepper on a bet, which remained the most pain he had ever voluntarily inflicted upon himself. But being tied to a metal chair in the middle of an alien torture chamber? Yeah, this was shaping up to be a real contender. Across from him, 2 towering Zirac warriors observed him with unblinking yellow eyes. One was General Voron, the big one with the jagged crest on his head and an ego so large it probably needed its own gravitational field. The other, his second-in-command, had a narrower build and the stiff, uneasy posture of someone desperately trying to pretend they had everything under control. Carter had been in their custody for hours now. In that time, they had tried electric shocks, subsonic disorientation pulses, and some kind of neural induction device that felt like a very aggressive migraine. He wouldn't say any of it was pleasant, but it was nowhere near as bad as they seemed to think it was. So far, the worst part of this whole situation was the fact that the chair was wildly uncomfortable. Voron took a step closer, his clawed hands resting on the interrogation table between them. Human, he intoned, his voice low and grave. Your resistance is pointless. Carter tilted his head, blinking blearily at him. I don't know, it seems to be working out pretty well for me so far. The Zirac commander's mandibles twitched. You do not seem to grasp your predicament. We have extracted information from species far more resilient than your kind. Carter raised an eyebrow. Aha! And how'd that work out for them? Voron's yellow eyes narrowed. They broke. Well, that's embarrassing for them. Voron inhaled sharply through his nostrils, exhaling a slow, deliberate breath as if physically restraining himself from launching Carter through a wall. He turned to Zack, muttering in their own language. Carter couldn't understand the exact words, but he got the gist of it. Something along the lines of, what is wrong with this thing? And are we sure this isn't a defective one? Finally, the general straightened, fixing Carter with a level stare. Tell me, human, is your entire species like this? Like what? This refusal to acknowledge pain. This arrogance. Carter chuckled. Oh no. Plenty of humans whine over the smallest things. Stubbed toes, paper cuts, bad weather. You should see people complain when the coffee machine breaks down. Zack's mandibles clicked together. Then why do you not break? Carter shrugged. Pain's mostly in the head, you know. Plus, you guys are really overselling this whole torture thing. I've had worse injuries from gym accidents. Voron's tail lashed in irritation. You are lying. I really wish I was, Carter admitted. Ever deadlift too much weight and throw your back out? Absolute nightmare. I was walking like an old man for a week. Zack turned to Voron, his voice low. We should attempt something more direct. Voron nodded and gestured to a guard, who stepped forward and placed a thin, serrated blade on the table. The general picked it up with careful precision, tapping the tip against his clawed finger. We Zirac know that endurance comes in many forms. If electric pulses do not break you, perhaps something more visceral will. Carter rolled his eyes. Oh great, you're gonna cut me. So original. You know, I once had a medic stitch up a gash in my leg without anesthetic because we were in the middle of a firefight. This isn't really gonna... Voron slashed the blade across Carter's arm. It wasn't deep. A superficial cut, designed to sting rather than truly injure. Zirak warriors train with wounds like this all the time, considering it a mere inconvenience. Carter hissed through his teeth. Ah, damn it. He glared at the general. Come on, man, at least sterilize the blade first. What if I get an infection? Zach leaned forward. Did that hurt? Yeah, obviously. You just cut me? Carter gave him an incredulous look. What? Do you think humans are immune to pain? Of course I feel it. Voron's mandibles twitched in satisfaction. Then you will break soon. Carter sighed. No, you don't get it. There's a difference between feeling pain and letting it win. You guys seem to think pain is some unbeatable force of nature, like gravity or taxes. He shook his head. Pain isn't special. It's just noise. The room fell silent. Voron stared at him, unreadable. Zach, however, shifted slightly, his posture no longer quite as rigid as before. Carter tested the weight of his words, then added, You ever had a really bad headache? The kind that won't go away no matter what you do. Zach hesitated. Yes. What do you do? Zach glanced at Voron, as if seeking permission to answer. When none came, he replied cautiously, You endure it. Carter smiled. Exactly. That's all pain is. A really bad headache. Sure, it sucks, but eventually it passes. The two aliens exchanged a glance. For the first time since Carter had been captured, they weren't looking at him with contempt or amusement. They were looking at him with something closer to uncertainty. Voron straightened, his expression unreadable. You are unlike any species we have encountered. Yeah, I get that a lot. Zach frowned. Perhaps we should. A sudden, sharp beeping sound interrupted him. One of the Zirak technicians hurried over, his expression tense. General, there is movement on the outskirts of the perimeter. It appears to be human forces. Carter let out a slow, triumphant exhale. Right on time. Voron turned back to him, studying him carefully. Your people have come for you. Carter grinned. Yeah, and you're about to find out just how stubborn we really are. Sergeant Daniel Carter had to admit, this was starting to get interesting. Up until now, the Zirak had treated him like an amusing curiosity, a small, strange creature that refused to behave as expected. But after the perimeter alert, everything changed. The air in the chamber shifted, thick with something he could only describe as unease. Voron loomed over him, mandibles clicking in thought. Your forces are approaching. Carter leaned back in his chair, rolling his shoulders against the restraints. Yeah, that does tend to happen when you kidnap one of us. Zach's tail flicked once, betraying irritation. You assume they will succeed? I assume they'll give you hell trying? Voron exhaled through his nostrils, a low, guttural sound. Then we have little time. If you will not break through simple means, we will escalate. Carter smirked. Oh, good. I was worried this interrogation wasn't hitting its dramatic peak. The guards unfastened his restraints, yanking him upright. His legs were stiff from hours of sitting, but he shook it off as they dragged him into another chamber. The walls here were smoother, sterile, a place built for precise, controlled suffering. Zach gestured to a mechanical contraption in the center of the room, a vertical slab equipped with clamps, restraints, and an array of sinister-looking devices. This will measure your limits. Carter eyed the setup, then gave a low whistle. Fancy. What, you guys get this custom-made? Or is there a galaxy-wide market for torture, but make it science? No one answered. Voron motioned, and the guard secured him against the slab, metallic clamps locking around his wrists and ankles. Carter flexed his fingers experimentally, feeling the cold press of the restraints. Zach stepped forward. This device stimulates pain receptors beyond natural thresholds. A Zirak warrior lasts approximately 7 minutes before unconsciousness. Carter raised an eyebrow. 7 minutes? That's the record? Wow. Okay. Voron's gaze sharpened. You mock us? No, Carter exhaled, shaking his head. You ever hear of kidney stones? Zach blinked. What? Kidney stones. Tiny, spiky little bastards that sometimes form in human kidneys. When they get bad enough, you have to pass them through your, he cleared his throat. Let's just say it's an experience. And let's also say it lasts way longer than 7 minutes. Zach made a strangled noise. Voren looked almost offended. You are saying, the general said slowly, that your species suffers such pain naturally? Oh yeah, that, and migraines, childbirth, broken bones, dental work. Ever had a root canal? It's like someone drilling into your skull, except you're awake for it. Carter's grin widened. And we pay people to do it? Voren's jaw clenched. Begin. The machine hummed to life. A series of pulses surged through Carter's nervous system. Sharp, searing jolts meant to mimic extreme injury. His body tensed involuntarily, his breath hitching. Yeah, that sucked. No denying it. But he'd been through worse. His first instinct was to bite down, to brace against the agony. But instead, he forced himself to relax. Pain demanded resistance, and resistance gave pain power. So he let it happen. The Zirak warriors watched, waiting for the screams, the convulsions, the inevitable breaking point. Instead, Carter let out a slow breath and muttered, "Okay, yeah, that one got my attention." Zach took an uncertain step forward. Increase intensity. The pulses grew stronger, targeting deeper nerve clusters. His vision blurred at the edges, sweat beading on his forehead. It felt like white-hot needles threading through his bones. Still no screams. Instead, Carter clenched his teeth and forced out, I had a buddy in training, got hit by a stun grenade at close range. Dude went into convulsions, pissed himself, the whole deal. But the worst part? He swallowed, exhaling shakily. He had a date that night. Still went? Voren's eyes narrowed. What? Yeah. Could barely hold his fork, kept twitching like crazy, but he powered through. Said he'd rather suffer than miss dinner with a pretty girl. Carter grinned despite the pain. That's human endurance. Voren motioned sharply, and the technician cranked the machine higher. The pulses turned into waves of raw agony, burning through every nerve ending at once. Carter's muscles locked, his breathing shallow. But still no screams. He saw Voren's expression shift. Frustration. Uncertainty. Something dangerously close to doubt. Zach, standing beside him, murmured, "This is not possible." Carter let out a breathless chuckle. "Buddy, I haven't even gotten started." Sergeant Daniel Carter had to admit, this was the most fun he'd ever had while being tortured. Not that the pain wasn't real. It absolutely was. His nerves were on fire, his muscles spasming against the restraints, his body screaming at him to give in. But here was the thing. Carter had made peace with pain a long time ago. Pain was a fact of life. Pain was a training exercise. Pain was trying to assemble cheap furniture without instructions. Pain was temporary. But to the Zirak, pain was everything. And that was why this was so much fun. Voren loomed over him, mandibles twitching, frustration simmering behind those yellow eyes. Zach stood beside him, his normally rigid posture faltering. The technician running the machine looked between them, clearly unsure whether to keep going or unplug the whole thing before their worldview collapsed entirely. Carter, despite everything, grinned through clenched teeth. Gotta say, I expected more from the galaxy's toughest warriors. Voren's claws tightened at his sides. You think this is a game? Well, I'm definitely winning. Zach took a sharp step forward. No being can withstand this level of agony indefinitely. Guess I didn't get that memo, Carter rasped. Voren's tail lashed. Then we will find your limit. A new wave of pulses slammed through his body. His vision went white, every nerve in his body shrieking at once. It felt like being set on fire from the inside, like drowning in pure agony. He let out a strained breath. His heart pounded. His fingers trembled in their restraints. And then he started laughing. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't bravado. It was sheer, uncontrollable amusement at the absurdity of it all. Voren's mandibles flared. You laugh. Sorry. Carter wheezed between ragged chuckles. This reminds me. He sucked in a breath. Oh man, you ever had food poisoning? Zach blinked. What? You ever eat something bad and spend 12 hours in a bathroom, just praying for the sweet release of death? Carter grinned weakly. Because I have. And I swear to God, that was worse than this. Voren's jaw clenched so hard Carter thought he might snap a tooth. This is impossible, Zach muttered. Pain is absolute. Carter shook his head. Nah, pain's just a suggestion. Vorin exhaled sharply. You are the most insufferable creature I have ever encountered. Thanks, Carter said. I try. The machine powered down with a heavy click. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Carter slumped in his restraints, body still thrumming from the residual agony. But he was very much still conscious, still smiling. And the Zirak had no idea what to do about it. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Carter saw something new in Vorin's eyes. Fear. The chamber was quiet, too quiet. Sergeant Daniel Carter's body still felt like it was on fire, every muscle aching from the unrelenting waves of pain he'd endured. But the worst was over. He was still alive. More importantly, he was still smiling. Vorin stood motionless, his posture rigid, his claws twitching as if trying to restrain the primal urge to lash out. Zack was a few steps behind him, his antennae drooping, an expression of stunned disbelief painting his face. For the first time since Carter had been captured, the mighty Zirak warriors didn't know what to do with themselves. Carter finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse but steady. Well, that was fun, huh? Vorin's eyes narrowed. You should be broken. Should I? Carter cocked his head. I mean, you've been cranking up the intensity for, what, an hour now? Thought I'd be curled up crying for my mom by now. He grimaced as another dull throb pulsed through his limbs. It did hurt, but I've had worse. Zack took a hesitant step forward. How? Carter blinked, surprised by the genuine curiosity in Zack's voice. How what? How do you endure this? You've fought through every method we've used. We've seen species with far superior physical resilience, but none have lasted this long. Carter chuckled, wincing as his sore muscles protested. Well, here's the thing. You guys keep thinking pain is something to fight, something to resist. But that's where you're wrong. He took a slow breath, the pain still making his every movement feel like a chore. You don't fight it. You just let it happen. And after a while, it's not pain anymore. It's just a feeling. Zack shook his head. That is not possible. Well, it is, Carter said, smiling despite himself. Trust me, I've been through enough crap in my life to know. Vorin's mandibles clicked sharply. You are a mystery. The resilience of your species is beyond comprehension. He looked down at the floor, as if considering something. But your resilience, it is impressive. Perhaps we underestimated you. Carter raised an eyebrow, his voice dry. Well, there's a first time for everything. He straightened in the restraints, which were now starting to feel like an afterthought. Listen, I'm not going to lie, this whole thing, it sucked. But you're the ones who decided to take me in. So what did you expect? The general didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked to Zack, who seemed to be quietly processing the entire encounter. Carter had gotten under their skin. That much was clear. But there was something else, something subtle. Vorin turned back to Carter, his gaze softer, more contemplative. Tell me this, human. He hesitated, as though the words were foreign to him. When your kind faces a trial, do you fight simply to survive? Or do you fight to prove something? Carter blinked, genuinely caught off guard by the question. What do you mean? I've seen many species fight for survival for the sake of the individual, but yours is different. You do not just fight to live. You fight to prove that you can. Vorin's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition passing over his face. You are not here simply to avoid death. You are here to show us that you will not break. Carter smirked. I mean, that's kind of our thing. Humanity doesn't quit. We've been through worse than you, and we're still here. If anything, we thrive when the odds are stacked against us. There was a long silence as the Zirak processed this. Zack looked almost pensive, as if the idea of fighting for something more than survival was a foreign concept to him. Vorin, on the other hand, seemed to be wrestling with something. The look in his eyes was no longer one of contempt or disdain. It was respect. The general's next words were deliberate, measured. I have heard of your kind. You are known as warriors, even among your own. But I did not understand what that meant until now. Carter's smirk softened into something more genuine. Yeah, well, it's not just about muscles and guns. It's about having something to fight for. The moment you stop fighting for something bigger than yourself, you've already lost. Vorin's gaze held his for a long moment. Then he turned to the guards. Release him. Zack blinked. General, are you certain? Voron's expression hardened. He has earned his freedom, and with it he has earned something else, something that we have not given to any other prisoner. He turned back to Carter. Respect. The guards hesitated, then released the restraints. Carter stretched his arms above his head, groaning as his joints popped. His body still ached, but the weight of the situation was finally lifting. As he stood there, free of his restraints, Voron spoke again. I do not understand your species, human, but I will learn. Perhaps one day, we will meet again. Carter nodded slowly. Maybe. But next time, let's skip the torture, huh? Zack made a strange noise that might have been a laugh, though it was hard to tell with the way his mandibles twitched. Voron gave one last look at Carter, then turned on his heel and walked toward the door. Go, he said, his voice still carrying a trace of something Carter couldn't quite place. We will not stop you. Carter didn't need to be told twice. He gave a small salute to the warriors, then turned toward the exit. As he passed through the door and into the dim corridor beyond, he couldn't help but laugh under his breath. Guess that's one way to make an impression.